and welcome to the latest edition of Paul Walsh Talks Advocacy and Influence. And today I am delighted to be joined by Katya Kalandadze. She is Managing Director with Teneo Brussels, Latvian native. Katya, why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Look, I've been working in Brussels since 2009. After a few years in the US, indeed I'm Latvian, US educated, and I've been, I think, happily building a career in public affairs and communications in Brussels, and I really love living in Belgium.
Was it the career you planned? Was this for a long time something you wanted to get into?
Originally, when I was studying political science in the US, I was considering a career in the academia, so that was sort of the first thing. But gradually I understood that I actually I'm more of a people's person, and I wanted to be doing something where there was more of a sense that you see the impact from what you're doing and meeting different people. And that's really, I think, what this career gives. So that explains the switch, but that was also done quite a long time ago already.
So healthcare and food regulation, these are areas that you're focusing on, areas that can be quite political because they have, they're emotive. They have a kind of a real direct impact on pretty much everyone's life. Everyone has kind of a position on regulation, a position on healthcare, a position on food. And so when it comes to that, when you're advising your clients, is it about shaping regulation or is it just about keeping up to speed with the regulations that are there and that are coming up?
I think honestly it's both, right? And it's really contextual. But I think recently, I would say in the current political and geopolitical climate, and frankly, if I think about healthcare ever since COVID, where obviously the role of healthcare companies mattered so much, but also in many ways the strategic role of agri-food sector for our society as well. Ever since then, I think the situation has also been shifting because in addition to shaping the policymaking agenda, now I think we're dealing with bigger issues, more of the big picture of the future of the European economy, the future of innovation in Europe, competitiveness. And in that sense, I think that gave a new impetus also to certainly some of the companies that I work with, because they have a say, and also because they see that this is a critical moment when you also need to step beyond just commenting on specific legislation, either reactively or proactively, but you also need to bring thought leadership, to be honest, to the table on the way bigger issues, right? On how we make sure that we don't fall further behind in terms of the competitiveness gap, or how we make the transition to climate smart agriculture. If you think about the agri-food sector, all of those bigger issues. And I think for those industries, since they also see themselves as strategic, certainly agree with that assessment. But I feel if you're strategic, you certainly need to then be part of that thought leadership and thinking together with policymakers about the roadmap of actions for those areas on a bigger scale than just reacting to, different little pieces of legislation or big pieces.
Yeah, because, my experience is that there is this role of the regulatory or technical manager, and companies can kind of see everything through that lens. And so what you're saying is it that in order to be strong in those specific regulatory and technical areas, you need to be participating in broader, big picture discussions?
Well, it's also a little bit about not having to be just a follower, right? So if you're not participating in the bigger picture discussions that ultimately shape what kind of instrumental decisions will be taken in terms of we should change this or we should change that to get to the bigger objective, if you're not part of that initial sort of scene setting, then you will find yourself either surprised or sort of behind the decision-making process. And if you don't want to be in that situation, if you don't want to be just a manager or just a follower, and you see yourself more as a thought leader, and I think everybody understands that the critical point in sort of the union's history, then I think you need to be a part of those bigger discussions, and you need to bring ideas to the table which are more than just like super niche focused on what happens to you if this or that is initiated from a regulatory point of view.
I guess if we take the example of, let's say, your healthcare clients, and they're kind of participating in those broader discussions, is there always an alignment between kind of public healthcare goals, which I guess is the type of thing that you would be talking about from a thought leadership perspective, but I guess this is not always, or these are not always aligned with the commercial objectives of a company. And so I was wondering, what advice do you give them on how to find a balance there?
Yeah, look, I honestly, there's always this exercise that I like to do, and it's almost like the simplest trick in the playbook, and yet I think it's the right start to those conversations. It's always like you think about that famous Venn diagram where you sort of say, okay, here are your commercial interests on the left, and you realize that those interests require some engagement from your side with the policymakers or regulators, and the policymakers or regulators, they are somewhere on the right, and they are driven mostly really by public health needs, unmet medical needs, the state of the healthcare system, all those kind of concerns, or maybe the what else can I say? Of course, the state of budgets, all those kind of things, right? So you need to ask yourself where it is that they are. Most likely, your commercial interests are not top of mind for them. In some situations, it could be if your issue is, if you were kind of an economy carrying company in some country where, for example, the closure of your facilities or something major like this really is top of mind, then maybe you can directly come more or less with your commercial interests because they are really intersecting with the public health and kind of economic interests. But most of the time, it's not like this. So most of the time, indeed, you need to think, how do I put where I am and where I want to end up in that kind of, in the picture of public health and the public healthcare system, and how do I find indeed the place where I meet the policymakers? And normally that place, well, it exists and it should be found, because at the end of the day, as a healthcare company, pharma or medical devices, you are ultimately driven by what the patient needs, what's required. Otherwise you also, it's both, you wouldn't be in business, and also in terms of values, that's what you're driven by. So at the end of the day, there should be, and there always is, that place that you're able to find, but you also need to move right closer to policymakers. You need to see yourself as part of a bigger picture, right? So not just you individually, somehow above others, but understand that you're part of the complex sort of health ecosystem where you also need to interact with other players and together find something that would help you make headway, right, in terms of your interests as well.
Is it quite easy for you to get your clients to embrace this approach?
I think the quick answer is that depends, but it's certainly something that I certainly always say this, right? That you can never anticipate that somebody is exactly, first of all, sees your vision, sees your point of view. You need to try to put yourself in their shoes, even if you disagree. And sometimes indeed the clients can be quite, already unhappy with, in some cases, with what they feel is coming towards them from the policymakers. And yet, always, yes, persistently, I would advise that we need to take a moment to sit down, to think, what is their position, what influenced it, and not on top, and still, like, no matter how good or bad it looks like, you need to think where it is that we can find that sort of enough consensus so that things can move forward in a positive way. And I think especially in Europe, it doesn't pay off to be too arrogant and sort of to show that you're too entitled in that sense. So again, here it really pays off to think of yourself, your company, even a really big company, as part of the ecosystem, and accept that you are one of the several players, sometimes many, and that policymakers are dealing with that entire complex picture, not just you. So yeah, always having those conversations.
So it sounds like you're telling people that their company is not that special.
What I'm rather saying to them is that we cannot expect that the policymakers think that. That's the point, really.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
And in some cases, maybe you even are, but do they know that? That's a different point, right?
Yeah. So even if you are special, maybe your audience won't appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Give us an example of something in let's say, client's message that will be a red flag. Something, a tone, some aspect of the content of it that could backfire with regulators, patient groups, policymakers?
Well, I think in a way I already touched upon that literally sort of seconds ago, right? When I was saying that you can often see that there's a different way of communication, different way of narrative building in different global regions. So I would say here in Europe, again, because of the extremely complex structure of the EU, different backgrounds simply and different history in different member states, because of the more just different approach to policymaking and communication, it does not pay off really in my experience if you come in very brash, again, very entitled. So it pays off if you come in and you explain where you're coming from. You also have done your homework and you show that you understand how you're part of the bigger picture of the entire ecosystem, that you show some understanding of the need to constructively engage, ask the policymakers what you can do together. That's a better way to do business in Europe, certainly with policymakers.
I would be interested to discuss the contrast in approach that, let's say, NGOs take compared to industry representatives, compared to companies, compared to trade associations. Do you think that we have a healthy dynamic, or do you think there's an issue with kind of the fact that, let's face it, sometimes NGOs tend to go for the more emotional arguments, the more political arguments? Do you think that's an issue, and how can an organization, a consultancy, helping to represent industry really try to address that?
Look, honestly, I think that there's a lot that can be learned, and I think the industry is learning from the NGOs as well. So the fact that the NGOs bring this very, very often, right, very emotional message, very, personal, very often, not just kind of based on dry facts, as sometimes the industry can. What it certainly teaches us is that a successful narrative or a successful campaign need to combine those different elements. And certainly what NGOs do well is that kind of emotional charge. And I always advise clients to definitely be honest and show their values. And also not be afraid to speak in a human sort of tone and to show where they come from emotionally. And honestly, especially if you think about healthcare, it's a business that ultimately is about bringing life-saving medicines and life-changing solutions to the market. The emotional component is automatically built in there, but traditionally the industry hasn't always been good in communicating that. Right, or been, in real life, I'd almost say not in touch with their feelings, you could say, right? And I think that's what the NGOs sort of show us, that's how you get places. At the same time, what I also see is that over-indexing on emotion that is not necessarily substantiated by a thorough fact check, that is also not the way to go, right? So the best way is certainly making sure that you're doing both sides.
And so I can picture you then in discussions, conversations where you're encouraging your clients to come out of their comfort zone a little bit, kind of
a little bit,
not sacrifice the factual element of what they want to present, but also to embrace that kind of storytelling, messaging, and emotional elements too.
Yes, and what I've seen over the years is that the industry is also really evolving in that sense, right? Both in healthcare and in the agri-food sector. There is an understanding about the importance of showing your connectivity to your patients or farmers you work with, that all of those stories is what makes your overall story human, right? It shows that you're not just one big plant or one big office somewhere, but you're interacting with real people, you're changing their lives, you're making decisions together in many situations. So it's really what kind of moves things.
Healthcare, okay, it's traditionally very much seen as a member state competence. Is that a kind of issue for an organization that's focusing on representing medical company interests in Brussels, or is that changing, or is that not a kind of a false interpretation of how things actually are?
Well, first of all, I think it is changing. It has been really ever since COVID, right? Ever since COVID, the EU has been, well, let me take a step back. What's in the treaties is in the treaties, right? And indeed, member states are very much protecting their competence in that area. But nonetheless, within what's possible for the EU, we have seen since COVID and since what the Commission, how the Commission engaged on the vaccines and so on, we have seen that the EU has been claiming much more of a space, right? And I think in the current kind of competitiveness-driven discourse, I don't know, if you take the Draghi report and the place of the pharma sector in that report, if you, sort of from the EU side, if you really start dealing with those kind of big picture questions, the competitiveness, the future of European innovation, you say the pharma sector is one of the cornerstones of that, then yes, you are certainly doing things in that area, and it's very much seen by the industry. And then, of course, the industry will engage. And there is also, honestly, quite a shift between, I would say, in that sense, between the previous mandate and the current mandate. Again, I think there's a momentum that the industry is very much seeing and seizing as well to engage with the EU on those kind of what I keep on calling the big picture questions, right? So there will always be things that will have to be done with member states, certainly super important things like agreeing pricing and reimbursement that will never go to the EU level, but there is much more. There is much more that the EU is doing where now, if you're a healthcare company, you can really engage. There's plenty, from intellectual protection to environment, to all sorts of things that impact pharma and again, agri-food as well.
Great. I'm from Ireland, and as a result of that, I picked up a little bit of the Anglo-Saxon cynicism about the EU, looking at it sometimes from a transactional point of view. It's changing because I've been in Brussels for so long. What's your personal view on the European project?
I should probably start by saying that for me, because I'm from Latvia, it's personally hugely important, because when I was growing up, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of Latvian independence, we've always had this concept that was referred to as the return to Europe, and in many ways been able to join the EU. That was part of kind of completing that return, right? And feeling that we are part of the European family. And it's both, kind of in combination with NATO membership, it's both about security, which you can imagine now is big in the Baltics again. But also it's part of that feeling that you can, that even from a small country, you can partake in a decision-making as part of the EU at the highest level, right? So from that perspective, I continue believing certainly in the project. And I think for sure that it matters. I would think the same for Ireland. But my perspective as a Latvian certainly is that we are getting collectively, sort of together with the EU, we're getting to punch above our weight, certainly because of the EU. And I don't see an alternative to that.
In your profession, then, is this a part of it? Do you see your role as playing a small part in this EU project?
I don't wake up and think about it on a daily basis, I suppose, right? But yes, I think so. And I think increasingly recently, again, because the criticality of the moment, it's coming, you switch the iron on and it will talk to you about that, right? So it's coming from everywhere. So it's impossible for me to avoid that. And we're having so many more conversations also with, for example, pharma clients about the impact of geopolitics. And you see pharma companies now beginning to hire, chief geopolitics officers and filling those kind of positions that never existed before. And so, frankly, yes, I think in that climate, yes, we also have that role, myself included, however small, in that kind of bigger project.
Is there a difference between the way that Eastern and Western European stakeholders engage with Brussels institution, whether it's kind of tone, access, style?
I think, first of all, that in recent years, even when I think like in the last 5 years, let alone 10 years, I can feel a growing sense of confidence, if you wish, and a kind of different stature from Eastern European stakeholders, from governments to business people, sort of across the board. It has to do, well, we've been in the Union now for some time. Countries like Poland obviously have a huge potential and have a lot to say when it comes to common European defense and all those kind of things. But also for the Baltics, which is my home region, obviously, in the current geopolitical crisis.
Yes,
context, exactly. We have experience, right? And I don't want to say that, look, we benefited from "we told you so," but in certain ways we did, right? It showed that we know something. We have an expertise and an experience in assessing certain geopolitical situations in our part of the woods. And it gave a new impetus and a new value. And you see now, I think, people from you see people from our countries in positions of more importance, if you wish, right? Even if you think just about the current College of Commissioners. So I see that growing confidence more in how our people communicate. And for the rest, look.
And just to interrupt you, and so the kind of Eastern European position, let's say, on Russia, that's a part of that growing confidence. So that was
for sure. I mean, of course, I also cannot generalize. There's Baltics, there's Poland, and then different countries in the former sort of, or in Central Eastern Europe might have slightly different perspectives sometimes on Russia, obviously. But generally, yes, it's part of that new stature, I think, that we have.
Okay, very good. What advice would you give to somebody starting their career in public affairs?
I always feel like it's the most difficult question. Look, I would suggest just in the beginning, make sure you speak to people who already been in this profession for some time so that you understand what that entails and you fully understand if that's for you or not for you. I feel sometimes I see young people sort of coming over the threshold, and with some of them you feel you're probably better suited to institutions and somebody is better suited to an NGO. So certainly I would suggest talk to people who know what this profession is about, ask many questions, try to be smarter before you make important career decisions. And certainly for the rest, I think, if that's for you and you're interested, from my side, I can say it's an exciting profession. It's especially when you work for an agency with the sort of ever-changing relationships, clients, issues you're working on. It's very interesting. It's very exciting. It's very fast-paced. So if it's for you, then just jump in and I think clearly we see, again, I will repeat myself, we are living through historical, I think, critical times. And so there will be a lot to do for people in our profession.
Is there anything else that you'd like to achieve in your career that you haven't achieved already?
First of all, I would like to say that I'm happy generally. I'm certainly happy at Teneo, happy with my career progression. But I think I'd love to see, to that sort of point, I'd love to see also more clients and more projects that have something to do with Eastern Europe. Because at the end of the day, overwhelmingly, still most of the businesses we work with, they are still Western European businesses or American, let's say, belong to what formerly we would have described as the Western world, right? So I hope that in my career I still get to see more innovative businesses and more ideas and more interesting people coming from closer to my home region, from Eastern Europe in general, because it would just give me, I think, personal satisfaction to see that and to help them.
Katya Kalandadze, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.